Hello, family. It's Afrikan Esq, and I'm here with you with my two brothers, Omowale and son of Malcolm. We are doing Revolution Live episode 2. Yesterday, we were actually supposed to do episode 2. Unfortunately, I had some horrible technical difficulties, so we had to reschedule it to tonight. But thank you, everyone, for joining, and we're going to get into this topic. So this is going to be probably more of a contentious debate than the previous video that we did. The reason being because we really don't agree on these points, and that is this is going to be a debate about economics inside of in the realm of Pan-Afrikanism. In particular, we're going to be having a debate about socialism. Many of you, if you followed me for a while, you might know that I identify as a socialist, and it is my position that socialism is African people's solution. However, there are lots of different views on what the real solution could be, and so we're just going to have a healthy discussion, a healthy debate, a respectful debate on what we think our solution is to the issues facing African people. So, with that being said, I'm going to ask the first question to son of Malcolm, and the question is. What do you feel is the economic philosophy that is best for a Pan-Africanist, or what is your economic philosophy as a Pan-Africanist?
All right. Well, yeah. Thank you. When it comes to economics, I think the principal question that that Black people or African people should be asking themselves is who controls their economy, and do they have their own economy, or do they share it with people who dominate them? So, so when it comes to the question of economics, it's always a rather unclear question, because many times I find that people are counting white people's money as opposed to finding a way to have a sovereign economy or a nation. So, especially here within countries like the United States, or, I mean, you see these kinds of positions in places like South Africa, or even Kenya, or even places where Black people aren't the only people who live in their country. So for me, I see these questions, these economic questions, principally within the context of race and racism, as to where how do you share an economy with racists? So when we look at the history of different African countries in the Caribbean, and here in the diaspora here in the Western Hemisphere, as well as in the continent, many times I think people misunderstand the nature of imperialism, because they only see imperialism within strictly economic terms, and they don't understand that imperialism is racism in many ways. So within racism, there's the domination of not just your economics, or not only the economic terms, or the ways in which your colonial oppressor, or the imperialist who's attacking your country, is dominating the economics of the country. I think people don't want to acknowledge that the cultural ethos of the people who dominate you is what dictates the terms of the way we understand economics. So, I mean, I think I might have said it a mouthful. So, I mean, do I need to clarify in some ways?
I have a follow-up question, but if you're finished with your,
Sure. I think I got what I wanted to get out, but go ahead and ask your question. I think it'll be good. You know, I'll bounce back.
So it sounds like you're saying that the issue of imperialism is there's an aspect of economics, and then there's an aspect of racism. So you wouldn't say that the racism is motivated by the economics?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say as I've read many socialists do, that socialism or rather, sorry, made a mistake. Rather, I would never say racism is an outgrowth of economic exploitation, as many socialists have said. you know, like many that do great rigorous historical analyses, but I don't think they have the grasp conceptually for what some of imperialism is. So people like, you know, CLR James, or people like Eric Williams, or, you know, people like, you know, maybe a Frantz Fanon in some ways, or maybe I mean, there's any number. I mean, it's a very common feature for people. I just read Noam Chomsky, and he made that kind of you know, there's the economic exploitation, and then there's the prejudice, and I think that's a misunderstanding of racism, because racism isn't only about prejudice. So like I said, I think racism is about it's about dictating conceptual terms as well as economic terms. So you see this not only within the realm of economics, you also see this within the realm of, you know, any field of human inquiry. So you see this in psychology, you see this in religion, you see this in language, you see this in every aspect of human, what's the word? You know, every aspect of human existence. Racism dictates the way that people become controlled, and imperialism is a totality. It's a way of white people totally controlling every aspect of a people. It's not, it is the economics. The economics is the material aspect of that, or how it has been manifested, but it's not the only way. Does that make sense?
I mean, I disagree, but you know. Okay.
I just want to make sure I was being clear.
Omowale, no, yeah, I understand your argument. Omowale, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't necessarily have anything to add. I'll wait to address the question. I'll hear what you have, and then I'll go from there.
Okay. Well, first I'll address Son of Malcolm's claim. Mm-hmm. I completely disagree that racism and the economic exploitation of Black people are not completely intertwined. In fact, I feel like if you're trying to figure out what came first, racism or capitalism, you're going to be playing chicken and the egg, because they came together. As Malcolm X said, you'll never find a racist country that isn't capitalist. You'll never find a capitalist country that isn't racist. So when you look at the history of the world, I like to divide history as far as you have discrimination. So you've always had people who did not like other people just because they were different. So for example, I might not like someone because they have a bigger nose than me. I might not like someone because they're a little darker than me. I might not like someone because their mouth is different than mine. You might have discriminations against different people. What made racism so different is that it wasn't just mere discrimination or prejudice, but it was a deliberate effort to not just have a prejudice against those people, but to control those people's economic destiny. And that is what, to me, separates racism from just prejudice. And I'm saying all this to say that when you look at the history of Europeans going into Africa, I don't believe that Europeans went into Africa because they hated Africans. In fact, you often hear about stories of Africans being in Europe, such as the Moors or...
say it again.
Which part?
You said you often hear histories of what? A motorcycle flew past me. That's why.
We often hear history of Africans being inside of Europe, such as the Moors, and not facing the same type of discrimination that they might face in Europe that had it been during colonial times. I don't think that Europeans got up one day and said, "Hey, we hate Africans. Let's just try to control their whole country. Let's try to or their whole continent." It was a deliberate effort, because what we know is that Europe does not have nearly as many resources, nearly as much capital as far as natural goods as Africa has, whereas Africa is the richest continent on the earth. So if we're not going to acknowledge, first of all, it's not a coincidence that the people who were the primary target of racism so happen to be sitting on the continent that is the most enriched continent, the continent that if Africans really were to count their resources compared to everyone else, every other continent would be lacking. So to say that that's a coincidence that they went in there for the primary reason of getting those resources, of exploiting the people for what they had, to me, it wouldn't make sense. There's other cultures that they could have exploited without, to the same degree of Africans, without having an economic agenda, but they chose Africa. And that's still the reason why they are so anxious about people who are Pan-Africanist, people who want Africa to control their resources, because the second that Africans say that we want to control our resources, the racists have completely lost their control of really their today's state of life, or how we live, how we're living in America, how we're living in Europe, or wherever they are. So, but just to back up from my personal economic philosophy, I think that the word socialism, people hear it and they you have different associations. The biggest association, of course, is Karl Marx. I do not identify as a Marxist. I'm gonna be clear about that. I believe socialism predated Karl Marx. In fact, even European philosophers would say that socialism predated Karl Marx, because he didn't invent the word socialism. It's actually a concept that's been around for a while. But I believe,
real quick.
I'm sorry.
I just want to jump in real quick, because there's something you said a while ago that connects to something that you're saying right now. And it's actually about Malcolm X, where you said,
well, okay, can you write it down, and then we'll come back to that whenever I finish my spiel.
Right.
So what I was saying is that we have to look at there are really two possibilities as far as what type of economy you can have. And people might say, oh, there's other possibilities, but I've never heard anyone list another possibility. Either you have a country that's capitalist or a country that's socialist, or you have a variant of those two. But as far as the extremes, you have capitalism, you have socialism. The definition of capitalism is that the means of production is owned by a few. Whereas the definition of socialism is the means of production is owned by the mass of people, the collective of people. What we mean when we say the means of production is things like water, land, natural resources. These are the things that no one can live without, or that you would say are a person's natural right to have some type of control over. So other than saying it should be owned by a few or owned by everyone, there's those really the two extremes of economic systems. So when I say that socialism predated Karl Marx, what I'm saying is that when you study traditional African societies, there have been almost all traditional African societies, and I would dare say all, but there's always an exception. Almost all of them had been living a collectivist lifestyle. When I say a collectivist lifestyle, a lifestyle where the things are done for the interest of the people. You might have a nation or a tribe, whatever you want to call it, and things weren't done as for individual competition, but when things were done by the leaders, they were done to benefit the collective. Things were owned by the collective. Land was not seen as a private property issue. It was seen as owned by the nation. So when I say that I'm a socialist, what I'm saying is that I identify with the social system that Africans were living in prior to being inflicted with capitalism. I also want to say that as far as capitalism goes, we have not benefited at all from capitalism. And since it's been introduced into the continent of Africa, that Africa has been in disarray. So I have no problem saying that capitalism is honestly the root to so much of the things that we're dealing with as far as not having control of our resources, because in a capitalist system, unlike a socialist system, whereas you would have the collective making decisions, in a capitalist system, you don't have to have the collective making those decisions, because you can have one individual who makes decisions as far as who's going to sell this land, who's going to sell this resource. And what we see happening today, and this will get into the next question, is that we have individuals that are making decisions for the collective of African people, and those decisions are having horrible ramifications for the people. But I'll stop there. I know you had some.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of what you said, in terms of what you said, I don't wholly disagree, but I think the thing is, my understanding of socialism comes from a different historical interaction with it. I don't think you can take something from before it exists and throw it backwards in history. I think, like, for example, the thing you mentioned about Malcolm X, about wherever you have this kind of society, you have a capitalist society. I'm misquoting it. I've heard it before. I'm misquoting it. You know the quote. Can you repeat it? Do you know it?
There's never been a racist society that isn't capitalist or a capitalist society that isn't racist.
Yes, that's the one. I would wholly disagree with Malcolm X on that, because capitalism is a natural outgrowth of mercantilism. So the thing is, racism has, if we look at what racism is, or racist antagonism is, there are people like his name is Clyde something, I forgot. He does a study of racism amongst the ancient Greeks and with the ancient Romans. So, and you also see these racist antagonisms even within Europe. So for me, when I understand capitalism and I understand socialism, I'm looking at them within their historical context, not necessarily what I decide I want socialism to mean for me. I'm looking at what socialism meant historically as an outgrowth of a particular historical process. So when I look at socialism as a historical process, as it emerged, where it originated in Europe, or as an idea where it originated amongst Karl Marx and Engels within Austria and Germany and wherever. And then when I'm looking at where it became, applicable towards revolutionary processes within Europe, and then it became extrapolated into the context of racial struggles in Africa and within the diaspora, what I'm seeing is it's not going to get from Europe to where Black people are without those avenues of imperialism, where these different colonial outgrowths or these different, universities or such, teach people those kinds of ideas. So when people try to throw them backwards in history, to me, that says you're violating the first rule of History 101, which is extrapolation. You don't take an idea that exists at 2018 and try to put it back into, 2018 BC. That seems to me what people like to do with socialism. But at the same time, what I'm talking about is a concept that I see attached to a particular history. What you seem to be talking about is not the same thing. You seem to be talking about Black people organizing themselves in a collective fashion. I would add they had their own ideological, or maybe not ideological, their own basis for the way that they did it that had nothing to do with socialism. And it's not just a word, there's conceptual contradictions too. No. First of all, we have to understand Karl Marx is a brand of socialism, and socialism is the word that Europeans gave to something that predated what they identified as a fair system. Yeah. There's something fundamentally different in Africa.
Well, no, because again, if the means of that's why we have to get away from the idea of, to me, the basic definition, forget all the other, things we could talk about. We could talk about scientific socialism. We could talk about all types of things. The basic definition is who should control the means of production. Should the people control the means of production, or should individuals?
And my question is which people?
What's that?
My question is which people? Because white people control the means of production in African countries. The people are talking about the people, but we got to name who the people are, who we don't want to control them.
Absolutely, and that's where you go next. So what I'm saying is, so me as a Pan-Africanist, when I'm looking at the issues going on with our people, the basic question is, if what we have going on with Zambia, as I'm sure everyone knows, Zambia went into basically couldn't pay the Chinese their debt because they've been taking out so many loans And now, because of that, the Chinese are seizing, I believe, the airport, as well as they've already seized Zambia's television network. And I think it's the electric company that they're also seizing. So when we have a situation like that, who should control the means of production? Should it be these individuals who are making these decisions on behalf of the Zambian people, or should the Zambian people have had a vote or some type of say in what was going to happen, because they're the ones who have to live with the consequences of that debt? It's not the leader, the African leader.
Or is it because some Chinese neocolonialist is the one exploiting their economy? What happens when somebody in Zambia actually does control the means of production? You know what I mean? So what I'm saying is, when you have sovereignty, you don't have to worry about that kind of exploitation. That's not capitalism. That's Chinese neocolonialism.
I don't agree that you would have to, but I do want to move it along for Omowale. He didn't get to get in yet. So go ahead, Omowale, and then I'm going to look.
Listen, I'm over here enjoying the back and forth. I'm laughing. I'm engaging with the chat. I just sent something out on Twitter to say Zach is over here flaming you up. So, all right. So do you mind if I share my screen? All right. I think you're muted. Hopefully I'm not muted, but I'm going to share my screen for the people. All right, cool. Boom. So just give me a thumbs up in the chat if y'all can see what I have on the screen, and I'm going to get through this really quick. I basically put together 12 slides to address tonight's argument. And the reason why I did this is I feel as though both Zach and I are somewhat at a disadvantage in a discussion about economics when we don't necessarily subscribe to either socialism and or capitalism. And I'm going to get into why, right? So I just want to walk the chat room through this really quick. I think we should all understand, and then Tyranny can go back and forth, and we'll see who the chat room thinks won at the end of the night. But basically, I just want to start by saying that my premise is really simple. I don't necessarily believe that we have an economic problem. I believe that our problem is basically a misunderstanding of economics and the current global economic reality, right? So what do I mean by that? Essentially, my argument is that both capitalism and socialism are outgrowths or extensions of white hegemonic rule, right, over African people's resources, over all people's resources, right? Because that's what whiteness represents, right? Whiteness represents a state of being that is not in conformity with the natural laws of the universe, with the natural laws of nature, so to speak. And it represents a sort of conflict. It represents a relationship, not just a relationship between dollars or between people. It represents a relationship with the earth, right? So whenever we're talking about economics, I think it's best that we first start by defining what economics is, right? So I have the textbook definition of economics here for everyone in the chat room, and it's really simple, right? The textbook definition is this: economics is a social science concerned with the optimal allocation of resources in the conditions of scarcity, right? So whenever we're talking about social science, right, we're talking about behavior. We're talking about interactions or relations between people. And when we're talking about the optimal allocation, that's what deals with capitalism or socialism, right? Under a capitalistic system, the optimal allocation would say that, okay, well, goods are privately owned and they're distributed in a way that best achieves a certain amount of profit for a few amount of people. And under a socialistic system, it says that goods are communally owned or owned by all, and they're distributed in a way that that best works for everyone. That's not necessarily the problem that we have when it comes to African people. We don't have a problem with allocation. We have a problem with control, right? So the goods currently are controlled by white people, and they didn't get them by setting up a system of capitalism or socialism. They got them by taking them. They got them by means of force. So I think that that's what we need to understand and deal with first before we try to deal with anything else, right? So when you get to white people's behavior, right, because white people fundamentally behave in a manner that is not in harmony with anyone else anywhere on the earth, right? So Black people have come up with all types of theories to try and understand white behavior. I mean, you got people like Elijah Muhammad who basically say like the white man is the devil, right? That's his theory. But then you have actual scholars who have studied white people and studied European behavior. And what I mean by European behavior is basically everybody who they've come in contact with on this earth. They've unleashed a program of genocide. They've stolen from them. They've raped their women and they've killed their children. This is documented behavior all throughout modern history, right? When we go back over the 500 years, this is what you see white people doing. We see white people exporting their culture, imposing their culture on people. And both systems of capitalism and socialism are just another means of white people imposing their culture on people of color or black people across the globe, right? So what I have here is basically just some different schools of thought in terms of how we explain white behavior. So you have people like Dr. Francis Cress Welsing that said, well, white behavior or white pathology is a result of them lacking melanin. Or you have people like Dr. Marimba Ani that says, well, white behavior has something to do with they're missing, a spiritual essence, right? Spirit is something that is common in all nature. And because white people don't necessarily have that connection, they can't exist in harmony with nature and with other people, right? So white people aren't just, killing or enslaving people. They're killing and enslaving the entire planet, right? When you look at what this current system is doing to plant life, if you look at what it's doing to aquatic life, like it's putting all life in danger, right? And then the last one I have here is essentially what they refer to as geographical determinism. And those familiar with Dr. Leonard Jeffries, he just breaks it down into white people come from a certain part of the world, what he refers to as the ice. And as a result of them coming from the Caucasus Mountains, they've always been insecure, right? They've been insecure when it comes to resources. So their relationship to people and to nature has always been one that is combative, right? So the reason why that is important is because if you take an environmental deterministic position, you understand that your environment determines your culture determines your consciousness, and your consciousness creates your worldview. Both capitalism and socialism are fundamentally worldviews that come out of a European paradigm, right? So it's important to understand that you cannot separate a European cultural paradigm from the ideas, or you can't separate the ideas from the cultural paradigm that produced them, right? So one of the flaws that I think that my sister is making in her argument, and often I think African socialists make in general, is that they accept that steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 are universal. What I mean by that is they believe that there is no difference in experience or culture between people here on this earth. So as a result, whatever the Europeans' cultural experience or history has been, we can just basically impose it on all people because European culture is universal. And I think that that's a major flaw. And what it makes us end up doing is we end up getting locked into these European ideological traps. So we heard our sister Tyranny start by saying there are only two possibilities. Well, that's what happens when you get locked into that European ideological trap. You say that either we're going to be left or right, we're going to be socialist or capitalist, we're going to be Democrat or Republican, we're going to be liberal or conservative, right? That's a trap. It's a fundamental flaw in thinking. And the fundamental problem that my sister is basically expressing is one of disorientation, right? We continue to construct our reality in a way that centers Europeans in our social, economic, and cultural lives, right? W.E.B. Du Bois used to refer to this phenomenon as double consciousness, which basically means that we are looking at ourselves through the eyes of our oppressors, right? So we continue to measure ourselves based upon the terms, the ideologies that the European has produced. So we look at his system of socialism and we say, oh, this is something that has always existed in Africa. So we'll just take a black paintbrush and we'll paint it and say, well, this is now black socialism, or this is African socialism. And I believe that that's a fundamental flaw in our thinking, right? So when you talk about economics in general, economics comes down to one thing. It comes down to relationships, right? This is a quote from Dr. Amos Wilson from his book, The Falsification of African Consciousness, right? So Dr. Wilson says, we're suffering from the absence of an economic system. Money is not a system. Money is what it is. A system involves the systematic and organized utilization of money, a systemized utilization and distribution of money. Without the pattern, without the system, without the organization, One does not have an economy. An economy exists prior to money. There were economies in the world before money was invented. We don't even have to a moment to have an economic system, economized system. So ultimately, when we study an economic system, we recognize that the economic system at its base refers to the nature of relationships between people. It's the systematic way people choose to relate to one another that makes an economic system, not money, right? So when it comes to Europeans, they have a systematic way that they relate to all beings and all people on this earth. It's called white supremacy. They believe basically in the divinity or the right of Europeans, what they refer to as manifest destiny, to control this entire earth, right? Another quote from Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, right? He's breaking down this, this is from Du Bois' Dark Water, but it's from a chapter called The Souls of White Folk. So Du Bois, I give you two excerpts. The first one here, he says, the assumption that all hues of God's whiteness alone is inherently and obviously better than brownness or tan leads to curious acts. Even the sweeter souls of the dominant world, as they discourse with me on weather, will, and woe, are continually playing above their actual words in obligato of tune and tone, saying, my poor unwhite thing, weep not nor rage. I know too well that the curse of God lies heavy on you. Why? That is not for me to say, but be brave. Do not work in your lowly sphere, praying the good Lord that into heaven above, what is all love, you may one day be born white. He says, I do not laugh. I am quite straight-faced as I ask soberly, but what on earth is whiteness that one should so desire it? And he says, this is how they reply. Then always, somehow, some way, silently but clearly, I am given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. So we're not dealing with an economic problem. What we're faced with here is a white problem. Both capitalism and socialism are just extensions of whiteness. These are just two economic systems, or these are two systems that is expressing whiteness economically, right? And if we look at the second excerpt, I won't read the full thing, but at the bottom it says, as to the darkest and weakest peoples, there was but one unanimity in Europe. Unanimity basically meaning consensus, right? There's only one consensus among European nations. That which Hindenburg of German colonial office called the agreement with England to maintain white prestige in Africa, the doctrine of the divine right of white people to still, right? So we're not necessarily addressing the fundamental problem that we have. What I'm telling you is that what we're this entire argument or debate that we're having represents a misunderstanding or a miscategorization of the issue, because the issue is not economics. The issue is our understanding of economics, right? Here's another quote from Du Bois where he talks about the African roots of war, right? So he breaks it down in this essay. He says, remember what the 19th and 20th centuries have meant to organize industry and European civilization. Slowly, the divine right of the few to determine economic income and distribute the goods and services of the world has been questioned and curtailed. We call it the process revolution in the 18th century, advancing democracy in the 19th, and socialization of wealth in the 20th, i.e. socialism. But whatever we call it, the movement is the same. The dipping of more and more grimier hands into the wealth bag of the nation until today, only the ultra stubborn fail to see that democracy and determining income is the next inevitable step to democracy and political power, right? So Du Bois is writing this at the beginning of the 20th century, where he's essentially making an argument that, hey, socialism is the wave of the future, but he's in the same time that he's making this argument, he's critiquing socialism for what he understands it to be, and as he sees it. And in this next part, pay attention to how Du Bois is defining socialism. He says, with the waning of the possibility of the big fortune gathered by starvation, wage, and boundless exploitation of one's weaker and poor fellows at home, arose more magnificently the dream of exploitation abroad. Always, of course, the individual merchant had at his own risk and his own way tapped the riches of foreign lands. Later, special trading monopolies had entered the field and founded empires overseas. Soon, however, the massive merchants at home demanded a share in the golden stream. And finally, in the 20th century, the laborer at home is demanding and beginning to receive a part of his share. So what Du Bois is ultimately arguing is that socialism is not necessarily some great class conflict. Socialism is the mass of Europeans requesting their share of the wealth that has been stolen from Africa. Socialism has nothing to do with you and I. One of the things that you have to understand is that when Europeans conquered Africa, they didn't conquer countries, right? Europeans conquered people. they created countries to facilitate the colonization process, right? So if you think that we can use their same colonies or the same institutions that they use to essentially enrich themselves and pilfer from Africa, then you're misled. And the last quote that I have here also comes from Du Bois. It comes from Du Bois' Socialism and the Negro Problem. And I'm going to end here and let my sister rebut some of what I said, because I know I've said a lot. But this is what Du Bois is basically arguing. He says, as a matter of fact, the socialists face in the problem of the American Negro this question: can a minority of any group or country be left out of the socialistic problem? It is, of course, agreed that a majority could not be left out. Socialists usually put great stress on the fact that the laboring class form a majority of all nations and nevertheless are unjustly treated in the distribution of wealth. Suppose, however, that this unjust distribution affected only a minority, and that only a tenth of the American nation were working under unjust economic conditions. Could a socialistic program be carried out which acquiesced in these conditions? Many American socialists seem silently to assume that this would be possible. Listen to what he's saying here. He says, to put it concretely, they are going to carry on industry so far as this mass is concerned. They are going to get rid of private control of capital, and they are going to divide up the social income among the 90 million in accordance with some rule of reason, rather than in the present haphazard way. So what he's saying is the wealth that is coming into these Western nations, the wealth that is coming into America, first and foremost, this wealth is coming into these nations because it's coming from Africa. It's stolen wealth. But as it comes into these nations, we're not going to haphazardly divide it, i.e., there's not going to be private control. We're going to use some type of scientific measure, i.e., socialism, to divide it among the 90 million. But then listen to what he says. He says, but at the same time, they're going to permit the continued exploitation of these 10 million workers. So far as the 10 million workers are concerned, there is to be no active effort to secure for them a voice in the social democracy or an adequate share in the social income. The idea is ultimately that when the 90 million come to their own, they will voluntarily share with the 10 million serfs, right? So I'm going to stop sharing there. And how long did I go? 10 minutes?
Not sure, but it's okay. Neither of you answered a question that I would like y'all to answer. What is the definition of socialism and what is the definition of capitalism?
Socialism is basically a means of production where as you said, where the socialism is an economic system where the means of production are controlled by the many, right, or controlled in common. And capitalism is an economic system where the means of production are privately owned or held.
Same for you, Zach?
Yeah.
So my question is, you just define a system where the means of production is owned by the many. Were Africans living like that before colonialism?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
What's that?
Jack, put yourself on mute. So the answer. Karen, you got to put yourself on mute. The answer is no, because socialism is a system that comes out of an industrialized economy, right? An economy where Europeans have a certain relationship with not only the people that produce in the economy, but also with nature, right? So you cannot equate an economy that was built out of Europe and using European culture, right? Because this is wealth that was essentially, as you stated, was created using slave labor, was created using force, was created using theft. You cannot compare that type of economy where they are sharing essentially the goods of what's been stolen. So what was existing in Africa prior to Europe.
And I think the issue with this, with how we're trying to get to the bottom of things, is that I'm saying something, but y'all are adding to what I'm saying. So you just said socialism is the collective owning the means of production. That's the basic definition. We're not talking about European history, how Europeans. You can reject. What's your definition of social? Because I said what my definition is. My definition is simply a system where the many own the means of production. Mind you, we don't even have to call that socialism. We could come up with another name that if you don't like the name socialism because you associate it so much with European society, cool, give it another name. But we're talking about who should own the means of production. We don't have to go into a big historical debate. The basic question is, in historical African societies, did the people, the nations, I don't like calling them tribes, I rather call them nations, did the people of the nations own the means of production, or did individuals own the means of production?
The answer is in historical African societies, the concept of ownership, as you now place it, did not exist. There was no notion of any one person or state owning the land. The land was there for all to use in common, right? Like this notion of ownership, that you could own a piece of land, is something that is inherently and fundamentally antithetical to pre-colonial African society, right? So when you even try to put it into the brackets of, okay, capitalistic system or social system based on socialism, in order to incorporate socialism in Africa today, the goods have to be owned essentially by the state, because the state in a modern society or in a modern economy is the ways in which socialism is basically operated, right? The economy is nationalized, and then ideally each person within the nation would get a piece of the economy's output. If you've seen it anywhere different than that, please let me know.
Well, that's what a Marxist would say. Well, okay, I'm gonna answer, then I'm gonna go to you. That's what a Marxist would say. The Marxists would say that the nation has to own the means of production. And FAL, we came up with the position where we said we don't think that the state should own the means of production, that the people should. So when you have an arrangement where the communities, as we know, although Africa is divided by colonial lines, by nations that really, by countries that the borders really did not exist prior to colonialism, a lot of the people, the communities are still intact. So you can have the people of communities owning things. For example, if you go to different, I'll use the word tribes, if you visit different tribes, a lot of them, and I'll say from my experience, like I know for my husband's family, some of them who are members of a tribe, they still own the land. And if you want to buy land from them, you can buy land from them. Now, unfortunately, Africa is being so westernized that now they're trying to have the individual companies come in and basically sell land instead of having the tribes do this. But traditionally, the Ashanti tribe, the God tribe, they would own their own land. If you wanted to get something from them, you would get it from the collective. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying that the state should own things. And that's the reason why I wanted to get to the basic definition, because we can add on what Marx said, what Engels said, Chairman Mao, whatever. But the point is that we are talking about the basic definition of what should happen with our people, and however our people feel like we need to change it or make it fit our current situation, that's up to us to determine and to debate about whenever it comes to the point where we're actually regaining our resources. Go ahead, Zach, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think, like, while, I could probably pull a better definition of socialism from someone better than I can make one up here on the spot. But I think this is the problem that I have with trying to take ideas out of one context and use them in ours, because then it's like a ball stopper. That's what my friend calls it, where he says, like in basketball, you pass the ball around, the ball's moving, it's fluid, and then you give it to Melo, and then the ball stops, because he's the only one shooting now. I feel like whenever we throw socialism in the thing, then it stops being about, all right, contextually, what are we talking about, and what historically have these processes been, and it becomes, how can we fit socialism to what has it been? Because
and I understand your sentiment, because as people who have been colonized, and we have been, we don't have any memory of our true selves. We've been given someone else's definitions. We've been given someone else's frame of mind. I understand if you feel like the means of production should be owned by the people, but you don't want to call yourself socialist because Karl Marx was a racist and Karl Marx was, you know, this or that. Are you associated with too much that is European? That's fine. What we're talking about is the solution to our problem. And what I don't, you know, I'm not a reactionary person. Like, you know, oh, well, one second. And so, for example, I'm not a reactionary person. Like, I know that Europeans think that they invented democracy. Do I believe that they invented democracy? No, because Africans were living in democracy prior to Europeans. So now do I go and say I'm against democracy? Now, you know, I'm not saying I'm for it in every context, but I'm just giving you an example. Does that automatically mean? I'm sorry.
I'm against democracy.
Yeah. Well, I'm not where it works and where it makes sense. I'm all about what makes sense in a particular context. But I would never say, you know, oh, they came up with the word democracy. Oh, this is from Rome. No, African people were living like this before Europeans existed. And that's where we have to stop becoming, you know, reacting to the things that some things that they didn't invent. You know, they tell us so much. They tell us that they invented Christianity. They tell us that they invented they invented science. They invented math. And I'm not willing to give them the satisfaction of them thinking that all of these historical events actually came from them. If you know your history, you know that African people were living in these ways. I'm sorry.
What I'm saying is we don't have to give them anything. You mind? Thank you. What I'm saying is we don't have to give them anything. The thing is, we had what we had, but we had it on our own terms. So the thing is,
okay. So what were those terms? That's what we need to get to. What were the terms?
Well, my point is the equal sign will kill our people, because every time we try to conflate what it is that we had with what they have, we always end up losing an aspect of what we had in whole. So when we look at some governmental system with the Akan or larger, you know, maybe the Ashanti, and then we look at, or maybe even we look at Kemet, right? Or we look at we look at the Congo. What they had was fundamentally a different governmental structure. So why do we have to keep conflating or keep equalizing what we had to what white people had? Unless we're looking at validation. That's why I'm saying.
I don't. I call myself. I'm saying I don't. I call myself a social. The reason why I think, you know, and like I said, if you feel like, you know, the way that traditional Africans lived was ideal, but you don't want to call yourself socialist, by all means, like, I'm not someone that's picky over definitions.
I said, I'm not trying to be idealistic, but what I am trying to do is make people return to who we are within our own context instead of imposing someone else's context as a reference point. Because what that does is the conversation again and again.
Okay, I'm gonna finish my point, and then Omowale wants to chime in. You know, like I'm saying, for me, it's not about, you know, the only reason why I do call myself socialist, because I want to be very clear that I am fundamentally against what capitalism has done to my people. I am fundamentally against it as in the context of liberation, and I do not see a liberated Africa. Sorry? I'm fundamentally against capitalism. And
that's what I was.
Okay, it's hard to hear you, like, with the mic not muted. Yeah, what'd you say?
I said the spider did it, the spider went. White people did it, not capitalism.
Okay, so just to sum up for me, I don't like I said, if you don't want to call yourself that, but if we look at how we were living originally, regardless of what you want to call yourself, you know, to me, we should re-explore an economic system where all people were fed, where all people are taken care of. We didn't have to deal with things like homelessness and all these sickness and diseases, people not having access to healthcare and all these things. We weren't dealing with these things when we were in our traditional context. We're only dealing with them because we have adopted the white man's system of capitalism. And again, when I say I'm a socialist, all I'm saying is the means of production should be owned by the people. I don't believe it should be owned by the state. I don't believe that in the context of Europeanism. I don't believe in it in the context of the European. In fact, I'm going to read from Julius Nyerere. And for those of you who don't know, he was the first president of Tanzania. He was he identified himself as a socialist, but not as a European socialist. He was very clear to differentiate the two, because to him, you cannot apply what happened in Europe to Africa, because how can you apply what happened in Europe? Europe went through a whole nother history, went through different things that Africa didn't go through. Africa never had to deal with, you know, things like feudalism. Africa was not on the same train that Europe was on. So to apply the European socialism to Africa would not work well, where Africans were already living like this prior to colonialism. So just to read briefly from him, this is Ujima Essays on Socialism, Julius Nyerere. He says, the European socialist cannot think of his socialism without its father, capitalism. Brought up in tribal socialism, I must say I find this contradiction quite intolerable. It gives capitalism a philosophical status, which capitalism neither claims nor deserves. For it virtually says, without capitalism and the conflict which capitalism creates within a society, there can be no socialism. This glorification of capitalism by the doctrinaire European socialists, I repeat, I find it intolerable. So you see him first differentiating that what European socialists do, or Marxists do. They believe in the process of first capitalism, then it has to lead to socialism. He's saying that this is not applicable to African people. He goes on to say, the African socialists, on the other hand, did not have the benefit of the agrarian revolution or the industrial revolution. It did not start from the existence of conflicting classes in society. Indeed, I doubt if the equivalent for the word class exists in any indigenous African language, for language describes the ideas of those who speak it, and the idea of class or caste was non-existent in African society. The foundation and the objective of African socialism is the extended family. The true African socialist does not look at one class of men as his brethren and another as his natural enemies. He does not form an alliance with the brethren for the extermination of the non-brethren. And then, sorry, he then says, he regards all men as his brethren, as members of his ever-extending family. So, you know, I'll move on. I feel like I'm dragging this on too much. Should we move on to the next subject, or?
I had a few questions. I had a few questions.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
All right, so I have two questions for you. The first is this: when Europeans colonized Africa, did they colonize people or did they colonize countries? And the second question I have for you is, I think that we will both agree that socialism and capitalism are forms of economies, right? I would like for you to define an economy for me. Like, define economics. What's your definition? So those are my two questions for you.
So the first question, you said, did they colonize countries? They did not colonize countries, because you can't say they colonized countries when they divided up nations in order to draw the lines of colonialistic countries. So yes, they colonized people, like you said earlier. Do you want to follow up with anything on that before I answer the next question?
Answer the second question.
How do I define economy? I define economy as the people organizing in a way that will, organizing in a way as to who will be the beneficiaries of what the people have. So for example, in America, we're organized that Wall Street is the beneficiaries of what the people have. If we were in traditional African society, we would be organized in such a way that as the people who have the most resources, that we would all benefit from the things that we have. So that's how I define it. I'm not an economist, nor a political scientist, but that's how my basic definition of what an economy is for.
All right, perfect. So can you mute just for 1 second? All right, cool. So I'm glad that you didn't fall into my trap of the first question, right? Because when I asked, did Europeans colonize people or did they colonize countries? You're right, I did state the answer to that, right? They didn't colonize people, or they didn't colonize countries, they colonized people, right? They created these countries to facilitate the colonization process. The colonization process is essentially a process of Europeans stealing the resources from Africa to use for the betterment or the enrichment of Europe, right? They created institutions in order to facilitate that process. They created banking institutions, and the institutions that they left behind when they left during the period of independence, or when African colonies were essentially rising up in the 60s and gaining their full independence. These institutions that they created and put in place for the enrichment of Europe never went away. The only thing that changed is they put black faces in charge of them, right? So the reason why I asked you for your definition of economics is because, yes, we both agree that socialism and capitalism are economic systems, but these are systems that only deal with the allocation of resources, as you just stated in your definition. You use the example of resources being distributed by corporations or by the stock market or whatever it may have you in a capitalistic society. Our problem isn't one of allocation. Our problem is one of control. Right now, the European fundamentally controls all the resources on the African continent. And the European, during the colonization process, put in place institutions to manage the pilfering or the theft of those resources. That paradigm has not changed. So even when you bring up people like Julius Nyerere, we have to look at who Julius Nyerere is, right? Julius Nyerere is a son of a chief, right, from a colonized or conquered people. One of the practices of Europeans were to look for ideal candidates, right, from certain family lines to bring to Europe to be educated, to come back and manage the European property or the European colonies. Julius Nyerere was quoted as, not himself quoted, but Western powers looked at him as the most responsible African leader of all the leaders during independence. In fact, Julius Nyerere's socialist government received more Western aid than any other government during the period of independence. So you have to question this type of socialism that he came up with. And again, I'm making the argument here that what Black people are essentially doing is we're looking at the arguments that Europeans are making between socialism and capitalism, and then we're looking at socialism and saying, oh, in Africa, you know, we had this. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to fit ourselves into their system, and then we remix it to apply it to our reality. That does not work. And the reason why that does not work, and the reason why the Western powers did not care about Julius Nyerere's socialism, because it doesn't matter to them who is managing their institutions, right? That doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, all the goods and the output of these institutions are going to the benefit of Europe. As long as that fundamental relationship doesn't change, you can call yourself a socialist, you can call yourself a capitalist. The only thing that you're doing is just further perpetuating European dominance and control over African resources. So with that, I'll cede my time.
First, I'm going to disagree with you that Julius Nyerere was not seen as a threat. I encourage anyone to look up CIA documents reporting their surveillance of Julius Nyerere. Second, you know, when we look back at a lot of
I'm sorry.
Second, you know, to me, it's more about, you know, when it comes to critiquing people from the past, I always say you could critique their philosophy. When we're reading their philosophy. For example, I could have said, well, W.E.B. Du Bois, why should we be listening to your quotes from him? Because he won against Marcus Garvey. Critique his philosophy. And if you disagree with anything that he said in the book, then you're more than welcome to disagree with that. But critiquing, you know, whether or not he got Western aid, we should know that a lot of our leaders were compromised in some ways, but to me, what were they saying inside of the context of what they were trying to get our people to understand? But I want to like go back to your point. You said our problem is not allocation, it's what?
It's control.
Okay, so our problem is not allocation, it's control. Here's my question. If our problem is not allocation, and how do we stop people from continuing to control our resources?
Glad you asked that question, right? Because we're supposed to be a space for Pan-Afrikanism. Now, I think that as Black people, right, we don't necessarily have an economic problem. Our problem is an IRS problem. And what I mean by that is we have a problem of identity, relationships, and seriousness. right? We don't identify ourselves on terms that will allow us to come together and unify so that we can actually overturn this white hegemonic rule that we have over European resources. And the second problem that we have is we refuse to identify an enemy. The European, all throughout his history, all throughout his documents, anything that you read, has identified us as his mortal enemy. He has identified our resources, our land, and our people as his own. So again, we don't have an economic problem, it's an identity problem. And then we have a relationship problem. We don't relate to each other as African people. We relate to each other based upon the terms that Europeans have put on each other. So until we kind of like fix this problem of relationship, we can't fix this problem of economics, because economics, right, the social science, meaning behavior, relationships between people, is nothing more than relationships between people. And last but not least is the problem of seriousness. We aren't serious about getting this European off our back. We're not serious about regaining control of our systems, because if we were serious, the conversation wouldn't be about socialism or about capitalism, because we would realize that neither one of those matter if we don't control, if we don't have sovereignty, right? You cannot have sovereignty, you cannot have dominion over resources that somebody else is currently controlling. So until we fundamentally change the paradigm, and the only way for us to do that is do what I believe is a Pan-African project, right? I'm a Garveyite. You mentioned Du Bois and saying, discrediting my use of Du Bois, but I just want to make it clear that the reason why I'm using Du Bois, because he's someone who was full of confusion, but at times he was also full of clarity. And he referred to himself as a socialist, and he was also a card-holding member of the Communist Party, right? So if you're someone who considers yourself a socialist, I'm using a socialist and their critiques of socialism to show you why it will not work, right? I'm fundamentally showing you the flaw in that logic. And secondly, I'm not necessarily critiquing Julius Nyeri's person. What I'm critiquing is, if you're saying that your system is based upon Ujamaa, right? Julius Nyeri's economic system. What I'm telling you is this economic system was so welcomed by the West, by all the capitalist nations of the West. They welcomed Julius Nyeri's systems. Why is that? The reason why is because it fundamentally does not change the relationship of ownership and control. They were completely okay with Julius Nyeri implementing his form of socialism. In fact, they backed it and were more than willing to fund it.
I don't agree. First, I'll start with your last point. We have to study more why they weren't bothered by it, because one thing that Julius Nyeri did is that he nationalized all of the banks, and basically there were no more European banks in Tanzania. If any former French colony were to nationalize all their banks, you trying to say that would not be a threat to France? You know, who owns they have African banks that are basically going on francs. If they were to do the same thing, that some of the things that Julius Nyeri did, nationalizing several industries, I think personally, and it has to be studied more, that it could more have to do with what was at stake in Tanzania versus somewhere like the Congo, or somewhere like France that basically had, if France didn't have control of its colonies, that France would not be able to live, period. But I think it does warrant more study, and it's a good question. Why I wouldn't say they weren't welcoming, because again, you could look up CIA documents where they're talking about how they view him. But we could look through more research on why he was not as demonized by the West. Here's my problem, she said. You're not solving the problem. We are dealing with a system. Technically, our people are sovereign, technically, because they're sovereign in name. They are independent governments. They are no longer satellites connected, with the exception of former French colonies. I will say that African countries are independent governments, technically. The problem is that when you have a democracy, an independent government, when you have individuals who are easily corruptible in positions where they can make decisions that affect the whole people, you have to create a system where if you have one weak link, because when people say, oh, we need African unity, oh, we need to identify an enemy. I'm reading off what you said. We need, we need to have, a relationship with each other. Well, that's fine. But guess what? If you're trying to say that there's going to be a day where every single African is completely for African unity, and there won't be a weak link in the chain, that there won't be a leader who gets in power. And what happens in neocolonialism, we have to understand why neocolonialism is so effective. It's because you can have a leader. So we use the leader of Tanzania right now. He was elected by the people, so he was chosen by the people. But guess what? The Chinese government, they meet with him in secret. When they meet with him in secret, they offer him billions of dollars. And him being a weak link, he's going to agree to this, even if it doesn't benefit the people. So that's when the problem does become allocation. Who should have the power to make those decisions? If we can't figure out who should have the power to make the decisions over the economics of Africa, then we're not ever going to be able to resolve our problems. So just to say again, these things sound nice. They sound like, oh yes, we need. And I agree with, let me finish my point. I agree with all of them. We certainly need unity, but we have to understand there's never going to be a day where there's not a weak link in the chain. We have to learn from colonialism and build a system where we can, and we have to learn from neocolonialism and build a system that is resistant to the types of attacks that come from outsiders, wherever they want to offer exponential amounts of money to a weak link in order to have access to our resources.
So can I add about what you're saying about neocolonialism?
Let's go, because he hasn't gone.
Okay.
So one of the things that you said about allocation, or neocolonialism rather, the reason recently I've been doing a lot of reading about Haiti, and what I realized about neocolonialism, I mean, I knew this some years ago, but it made it very clear to me recently, neocolonialism is just colonialism. It's just colonialism by proxy. So what it is your colonial powers, what they do is like how Omowale had said, a colony is a business or a market that's run, a certain way. Those are the institutions of the colony, and then you have a governing structure that is a satellite of the imperialist power. So what it is neocolonialism is, we take that government, that colonial structure, those institutions that were created for the market of exportation of those resources. What we do is we basically put Black people in charge of it, and we allow them to continue to export whatever those resources are, as well as own the property or own the land in those places. So what it is after these revolutions, you have the West well, not just the West, when I talk about these different countries, I'm generally talking about the West. What it is they come back and then they buy up all the land and the property and the rights to these different kinds of institutions. So what you have is, you don't have a fundamental change between colonialism and neocolonialism. What you have is flag independence. You don't have independence. You don't have sovereignty. We haven't had that since it's began. And in the places we have had it, they're the ones that are blocked off from everywhere else. And fundamentally, I think what that boils down to is a misunderstanding of the nature of imperialism. And the reason Haiti. Hold on. One more thing. The reason I bring up Haiti is because in Haiti, where you actually have, in many ways, one of the most genuine insurrectionary forces against white hegemonic rule, or imperialism, or European imperialism, they only stayed revolutionary so long as Dessalines was in there. And as soon as Dessalines was out, they reverted back to allowing other imperial powers to retain control and dominance over these colonial projects. So then they just kept switching hands from France to the United States to this to that. You see the same thing in Namibia. Germany, they got flag independence in Namibia, but Germans still own all the land. In South Africa, white people still own all the land. Like in Mozambique, Portuguese own the land all over Mozambique. Like, that's what I'm saying.
So who should own the land?
Black African people.
Okay, let's go there. African people should own the land. Which African people should own the land?
Where? Are you talking about in Africa?
You're talking about land. And land is one of the things that we consider a means of production. African people should own the land. Which African people should own the land?
African people should control the land on which them and their own communities live on. The problem is, excuse me?
That's socialism. I mean, and again, that's the European definition. That's what they call socialism, but that's how we lived prior to colonialism.
Not white people. You think the problem is capitalism, not white people. Like, that's the point.
Yeah, and I agree with what Zach said there, because tyranny. I'm so sorry. Anyway, what I was trying to say was that Europeans are, a tyrannical people. We've seen European tyranny all over all over this earth. So my sister Afrikan Esq, when she's saying that the problem is the system, I think that is a fundamental misunderstanding or mischaracterization of what the real problem is, right? Because systems are upheld by institutions.
The system is white people.
Hold on, Zach. Systems are upheld by institutions, and institutions are managed by people. Until you get to that fundamental level to deal with people, and white people came into Africa via manifest destiny and said that this land will be for us and for our progeny. Now, the debate that they're having, socialism and capitalism, is saying, well, the stolen goods that we're stealing out of Africa, are they only going to benefit a few white people, capitalism, or the stolen goods that we're stealing out of Africa, are they going to benefit a lot of white people, socialism? That's what you have. I think that until we get to that fundamental level, when we're dealing with the people, I don't think that we can necessarily have the proper conflict where resources that are currently controlled by white people, even if it's through black proxies, we will never be able to get them back, right? You keep talking about having the right people in power. So like you mentioned, like the president of Tanzania meeting with China. Well, that's what the president of Tanzania is supposed to do. And what do I mean by that? Hold on 1 second. If you give me 31 seconds, I'm going to stop right here. 31 seconds. You can count them down. What I mean by that is that country, that colony was created to facilitate theft. That's what it's supposed to do, right? So the people on the continent can vote people into power all they want. The only thing that people in power can do is essentially help to manage and facilitate the colonization process. And in colonization, the resources of Africa are not being used for the interests of African people. They're being used for the people outside of Africa who have colonized the continent. And that's the point that I want to make, that I feel we keep missing by making it about capitalism and socialism. You can go.
I think that whether or not y'all want to admit it, we're saying the same thing, honestly. And because when you're saying that, when I say capitalism, capitalism, we do know was not African. It was not African philosophy. It did not come from African people. The idea of capitalism is an idea of the individual obtaining or getting as much as they could and using their means that they obtained in order to solidify their place in society and thereby oppress other people. So when I say that capitalism is the problem,
can I push really quick on capitalism?
Go ahead.
Here's why I have the problem. And this again gets us into that European trap. Like we kind of like run from capitalism and run over to socialism, when the reality is there are tenets of capitalism that you see in pre-colonial Africa, right? We sometimes confuse commerce with capitalism. African people have always had
absolutely.
We've always had commerce and trade, right? And if you study the history of capitalism, Before, they were relating it to industrialized products. They were relating it to agriculture, right? So you're talking about the yield and the output of crops. So you're trying to tell me that at no place in Africa, who were in the business of producing crops and selling it or trading it to their neighbors, and when they were doing it, they weren't trying to profit, meaning they were not trying to take a loss. You tell me that didn't occur in Africa?
Absolutely, but guess what? It was being done for the collective. and this is why, you know, we could keep going back and forth on the you know, oh, you know, this is a European philosophy. Fine, reject what you've learned from Europe.
If you
well, let me finish. Reject what you've learned from Europe and research. Number one, reject what you've learned from Europe and research what we know from ourselves. And so, like I said, if you don't want to identify as socialist, the word socialist, because you feel sort of type of way from European socialists, by all means, study African history, study the African means of production being owned by the collective, and identify it that way. But my problem with these conversations are we're not learning when we don't want to address capitalism full front. And what I mean by that is that if we don't want to address how we're going to prevent things from reoccurring, then we're just going to keep dealing with this dynamic of neocolonialism. You cannot, if we actually asserted ourselves to where we are actually in control of our economies communally, then we wouldn't be having these proxy leaders, these puppets who are doing these things to us. So that's why I want to know from y'all. I know y'all don't have an economic philosophy, but how do you stop, as I said earlier, how do you stop the weak chain in the government? You have Black unity, 99% of people are for it, but guess what? You have one parliamentarian, and guess what? He's making deals with so-and-so. How do you stop that without actually addressing how the people control the actual economic portion of their economy?
I'm going to borrow a quote here, but I'm going to remix the words a little bit. My economic, political, and social philosophy is Pan-African nationalism. And what does that mean? That means that when it comes to economics, that African people should control the businesses in their community. They should control the land and the resources that are under their feet. When it comes to, I'm not going to try to do a word for word with Malcolm, but my whole point is this. You know, we don't need to identify as socialists. We need to identify as Africans. And as African people, we need to understand that the people of Europe, right, broken down into nations, have made it their goal to basically dispossess and displace us. And until we do something about that fundamental relationship as African people, we can call ourselves whatever we want to call ourselves. We can call ourselves socialists, feminists, capitalists, like whatever we want to call ourselves. It won't change the fundamental problem. And that's the point that I'm trying to drive home.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the problem. We get stuck on the label.
I think one thing that's important to add as well is that none of these so basically I like to use history as a reference point. Otherwise, we're just talking about our opinions. I think when we look at the historical movements of anything that considered itself to be socialist, they were all within some kind of nationalist movement, whether it was in China, whether it was here in the United States. Well, not here in the United States. You know, the socialists here wanted to be integrationists. But like, if we want to talk about in Europe, if we want to talk about even in Africa, it all happens within a nationalist context. So a lot of the time we want to talk about economic philosophy, but we don't even want to talk about a national economy or having our own nation or our own, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think, because not all socialists understand themselves within the prism of nationalism. Many of them don't.
Yeah, and I don't speak for all socialists. Like I said, I think that me saying I'm not a Marxist kind of puts me in a very different spot than most socialists. Quick point, both Omowale and Zach, y'all used the point nationalism, and I'm a Black nationalist also, but just in case you don't know, nationalism came from Europe. So maybe you should stop calling yourself a nationalist. Really? Although we know that I'm a Black nationalist. I think Black nationalism leads to Pan-Afrikanism, and I think that to me, I'm very solution driven. So for me, when I came to the process personally of calling myself a socialist, and like I said, I more so do it because I want to be clear where I stand when it comes to the issues of capitalism. For me, it was thinking about what is the solution to what's going on with our people. Now, I also, of course, I agree. I'm a Black nationalist in that I believe that Black people should own a means of, not means of attraction. We should own the social, economic, political institutions in our communities. Now, in Africa, when we're applying that to Africa, we have to think, okay, we own these things, the social, economic, political, how do we own it? And the issue is, if we're saying that we own it and without addressing how, then we're not addressing how we're going to prevent, how we're going to stop how do we stop neocolonialism? That's what I want to know. Well, I don't really, I'm fine with whatever you call yourself. How do you stop neocolonialism without addressing who owns the means?
I think when it comes to neocolonialism, I think there's different understandings that people come to when they understand neocolonialism. So the thing is, some people understand neocolonialism as blackface white supremacy, right? And when we say blackface white supremacy, are we saying when white people are no longer in the picture, are we going to behave the way white people have treated us? But the problem with that is, what do we look like when white people aren't controlling us? We don't look like what people are calling neocolonialism under, when they say Black nationalism, that reactionary and this and that. It's like, you'd have to look at the Maroons. You'd have to look at Angola Janga. You'd have to look at pre-colonial Africa. You'd have to look at nationalist movements. You'd have to look at the inside of those. You'd have to look at that. You can't just look at Julius Nyerere, but you can't look at, who's somebody, I'm just trying to think anybody. You can't look at Robert Mugabe and be like, yeah, that's neocolonialism. Like, because fundamentally there's no sever between European domination, imperial domination, and what Africans would be on the sovereign terms. So the thing is, we have to get sovereign terms. And that means in order to be sovereign, that means we can't imitate them. You're right. And that means we have to look at who we are. And that's why I think, a lot of the times people use African history and culture as a point of reference rather than using European history and culture as a point of reference. And we end up using European history as a point of reference when we use their ideologies, when we blackface their ideologies. We want to be Black Democrats. We want to be Black Bolsheviks, Black this, Black that, Black versions of everything Europeans are. But then we want to say, oh, neocolonialism, when you want to just be only Black or you want to be only African. You see what I mean? Like,
I see what you mean. It seems like you're stuck on the labels. And like I said, here's my issue with this, is that we have to understand we are all colonized. We have all lost our identity. The fact that we're speaking English on this podcast or on this live stream instead of speaking an African language means that we are somewhat compromised as far as knowing our true selves.
I'm speaking Ebonics. I speak African language.
Well, Ebonics, whatever. It's basically a mixture of, the English colonizers' language with our own African identity. But the point I'm trying to make is, we have been put inside of a context where we do deal with definitions. And like I said, I could be picky about a lot of definitions. I could be picky all day. I don't really care about that. If you don't want to call yourself socialist, cool. I think we got to wrap this up because it's coming close to 10 o'clock. So I think, I know we had a whole program as how we were going to do this. So if I'll say to the chat, to the live stream chat, if we could have like a few people just give questions, and we'll try to answer maybe like 3 questions. And while y'all are writing questions, I just want to hear, this is my question, what is the solution to the state that we're living in?
All right, so can you hear me? All right, cool.
Sorry, economic state.
So this is what I want to say. First, I don't want to let you get away with saying that nationalism comes from Europe, right? Because you can't make the argument that socialism is historically African and we know that the first nation.
I'm only making that argument as to show y'all how ridiculous y'all's argument is. That although socialism existed prior to Europeans, we don't want to deal with it. Okay, go ahead.
So I'll let you live. I'm not gonna come for your head on that one right now. What do we do to fix it? Well, I think that you have to go back to the beginning, right? I think you have to be radical. And what I mean by radical is like you have to go to the root of the problem. Now, when we look at how colonialism is implemented on the African continent, it always comes in three waves, right? You get your missionaries, your mercenaries, and then your merchants. The merchants is the last class, right? And that is the middle finger, not to you, but the merchants are the last class, meaning the capitalistic or the socialistic class. Merchants, meaning dealing with the economy. Mercenaries are mercenaries and the missionaries. These two work in tandem to destroy the culture of the people. Because once the culture is uprooted, the people no longer have a defensive mechanism to resist this imposition of an alien culture being imposed on them for the purpose of facilitating their death. So how do you fix it? I think that you have to get down to the root, and you have to separate yourself from European culture. Like you just mentioned, that we're compromised even on this podcast for the fact that we are speaking in English. So if you want to get down to the root of it, I think that culture is the problem. And the problem is that our friends are putting the economic cart before the cultural horse. So until we deal with the element of culture, which would then allow us to understand that not only have they taken our culture, they've taken the material and immaterial aspects of our culture. They own our land. Unless we change that power dynamic, I don't think that there's really anything. I think that we're basically just spinning our wheels in the dirt until we get down to the root and deal with the problem that they are currently controlling our culture, our land, our resources, all the above. So that's my perspective or my 2 cents. And I'll let Zach go, and we can take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it boils down to is it's a question of consciousness. And what I mean is, Dr. Molefi Asante, one of my teachers, he says, consciousness precedes unity. So the thing is, if we don't have the same understanding of what liberation looks like or what it means, or if we don't have the same understanding of who our enemy is, or even if we don't have the same understanding of how it shaped our consciousness, how can we retain any kind of movement that's going to stay together, and ultimately form, any kind of institution or in organization, or ultimately any kind of organized nation, something sovereign? We need consciousness. We need a critical mass of people with the correct consciousness that understand the root of this issue. And they need to understand the root, not just an abstraction that we call it, the spider web, as Bobby Wright calls it. We need to say the root of the problem is white people. And until we do that, we keep masquerading whatever the issue is behind all these different terms. So we need to say, this is the root of the issue, and this is who they are, this is our enemy, and this is who we are. The problem is we don't have our own terms for our own identity, and we don't have a basis to organize our politics from because of that. And then we start trying to use their terms for their politics and their identities, and we want to be black versions of them. And when our organizations don't work, then we exacerbate our own problem, So to me, the root of the problem, economics is one aspect, and it's a very important one. And it's the most visible and material one. It's the one that you can count up. But you know what? We need to deal with some of the other conceptual and psychological aspects that racism, white supremacy imposes upon our people. That's our solution.
My solution, before we get to the audience questions, I basically said it. I don't think it's just white people, because right now we see that Chinese people are doing the same thing that white people did, and we see that Arabs are doing it. And so we see that it's not necessarily white people. There's a program that's going on in Africa and a certain way of doing things in order to gain control of the resources. So to me, the ultimate solution to what's going on with the state that we're in with neocolonialism is to, first of all, learn our lessons. We have to do a study of what happened in colonialism. We have to do a study of why our people are in the conditions that we are in today. I believe everything is rooted in economics. I really do. I don't think that you can have a people that don't control their economics who prosper in other regards. So my solution is that we need to study what went wrong and figure out a way to prevent it from happening, to stop it from happening, first of all, but to prevent it from happening in the future. And again, I've said, to me, the only possible way to do that economically is to give the people, go to the people in the African communities and find whatever system that you want to craft, whatever type of way you want to do it. Every single nation, every single geographical location is different, but come up with a way that the people can ensure that their resources are intact for their benefit, and that it's not to the benefit of individual leaders, individual elected officials who are going to ration away the goods of the people for outsider nations. That's the solution to me. So did anyone see any questions yet? Let's see. So I'll read Cohen Davis. He says, my question is, have either of you ever lived in a socialist country? I don't, we're all in America. So I'm going to say probably not. I don't know if there are too many countries that you can say are socialist. There are multiple countries with socialist aspects. For example, if you live in the United States of America, there's a thing called Medicare. There's a thing called Medicaid. There's a thing called universal health care. That they want to get. You know, there's socialist aspects of capitalist economies that do exist. Some people would say that Cuba is the best example of a socialist country. And, you know, regardless of how you feel about Fidel Castro, they have done some remarkable things. But no, obviously we live in the United States. So I would say our ancestors did live in a socialist country. Nations, not country, sorry. None of you have a comment?
Omowale, you going there?
No, I mean, I thought she answered the question well. Like, I don't know what I can add to that. Like, in terms of that first question, have we ever lived in a socialist country?
Yeah, I mean, I thought she answered it well too, for the United States at least.
Yeah. No, I've never lived in a socialist country.
I seen another one earlier. I'm trying to see if I can find it again. Let's see. No, I don't see any other questions. Did you see any?
What African promoted as the language?
Can you repeat it?
Kujo Akompong asked what African language should be promoted as the lingua franca of the diaspora.
Pick a language. That's my answer.
I mean, I think the best way to address that is when we talk about a lingua franca, a lot of the time we're talking about a language that is a language of trade. So it's like a language that can be used across different nations, or, you know, by a particular empire that can be used to trade. Oftentimes, that's kind of what it is. That's why it becomes so standardized. So when we talk about a Pan-African language, a lot of the time, you know, people offer different kinds of solutions. Like Malana Karenga offered Kiswahili. And other people have offered, you know, new composite forms of different languages. I think at the crux of the question, I might be not answering the question directly, but I do think it's important for us to understand African languages, so that we can understand some of the cultures that they emerge from, and how some of these, you know, African cultures from different places emerge, not emerge, sorry, are intelligible, or they fit with each other, so we can see the common cultural lines on which we fit. So I don't think I answered your question directly in terms of lingua franca. I know there are people who have offered solutions to that. I do encourage the study of different African languages. I do include Ebonics within that, even though, because it's a whole thing where, you know, lexicon is not the only aspect of language. There's also grammar and culture and, you know, all those other things. But like I said, I think language is important, but I don't know if we necessarily, I won't say we have one. Let's put it that way. I don't know one. I'm not a linguist, but I support the linguists, and I'd like to learn. You know what I mean?
So I see two questions. One is kind of off subject, probably could be the next subject of a next broadcast, is can a person be conscious and be a Christian? But I think the other one I've seen is kind of related to economics. My question is, can a woman's right to an abortion be part of us creating a positive and prosperous Black community?
I think you're best to put.
Well, way to throw a grenade and get out of Dodge. Can a woman?
I'll answer, but I don't know if I have too much to add.
So my stated political belief, my stated cultural belief is I don't necessarily believe in or support abortion. The way in which I relate to life is not in the manner in which, you know, Europeans relate to life. I believe that, you know, the womb is something that's sacred. I believe that life, the children, is something that's sacred. So abortions is not necessarily something that I support. So I think that, you know, I'm not equipped to answer this question economically.
I think that the economic scapegoat for abortions. I also, you know, personally do not believe in abortions. I'm not necessarily someone who like I don't think it's a political issue to be, you know, going out here and voting for people just because they are against abortions. Because ultimately, I don't believe the government could force someone to have a baby, even though it is morally something that I would never do. At the same time, I think that a lot of people use the economic scapegoat a lot of time when it comes to abortion. And so there's this idea that Black women, we have to you know, make sure we only have a certain amount of kids, or make sure that it's only a certain time of our life. And because if we don't, then we're not going to have an economic future. And, you know, we have to understand that there is always a double agenda going on. There is a real threat as far as European security, as far as the population growth rate. You hear it in speeches from like Prince, I think it's Prince Harry from Britain or whatever. Like you hear it from the economists. They are afraid of the African population boom because it's happening very quickly. Not too long from now, Africans will be the majority in the world, even surpassing Asians. So I would just say, you know, be cognizant. You know, if you choose to do what you want to do, that's not my business. I don't have any business telling you what to do. At the same time, be cognizant that there's an agenda to get African people to panic and feel like it is in our economic necessity not to reproduce. But really, the ones who are panicking are the Europeans and other people who realize that once our population gets to a certain level, we won't be controllable.
Yeah, I mean, I like to add to Afrikan Esqu's point. Like she makes a pretty good point. I think a lot of the time, because the way the abortion question is always framed is a woman's right to choose. When somebody disagrees with that position, they say, "Oh, well, you're trying to tell me what I should and shouldn't do with my body," as opposed to, "All right, so what are some of the larger institutional and systemic agendas that are going on around an issue like that?" So from my understanding, like people as individuals, yeah, of course they will make their choices. You know, you'll choose what's good for you as a woman, you know, hopefully with information, you know, which I think these kinds of things that we're having here, these kinds of discussions will help inform, you know, different aspects of the decisions people might have to make. But I do agree where part of the system of racism, white supremacy is to not only retain the size and purity of the white race, but also to control the size of the populations of non-white people, and especially Black people, that they control and dominate over. So abortion is entangled within that, because within abortion it isn't only people's choices, but there's also institutions, and then there's also people being leveraged or giving incentives to not have babies, for Black people or Black women to be sterilized, or for Black people to not reproduce, or for, I mean, that's why you see like Bill Gates and, you know, what's his wife's name? Melinda, forget her name. That's why they over there in Africa pushing contraception. You know what I mean? Like they're over there. They have like in that, and all of that is an outgrowth of the eugenics movement, which is, I believe, is not dead, but has been reformed in many ways, because the agenda of racism, white supremacy always remains relatively similar. But, you know, as Malcolm X says, racism comes out with a new edition every year, like a Cadillac. You know, it's like they always doing the same thing. It just look different. They present it to you in a different way. So, yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
I think, okay, so I wanted that to be the last one, but I think Omowale sees one more question that you want to answer.
Yeah, the brother KW Don 7. Hold on, am I unmuted? I'm unmuted, right? All right, cool. The brother KW Don 7 asks, do you advocate for nationalization of rural resources only? What about manufacturing the resources to a finished product and then selling to the world market? So anybody can answer that. You want me to answer first?
Sure, I want to crack next.
I want to look up the question and look at it.
So it's KW Don 7. I'll post it in our little personal chat so that y'all can see it. Boom, just dropped it there. So to answer the question, do you advocate for nationalization of rural resources only? Me personally, I don't advocate for nationalization. I think that that's our sister Afrikan Esqu's position. Correct me.
Tell me you don't be listening to me. So y'all be trying to put Marxist philosophy on me, but go ahead.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm wrong. She doesn't advocate for it either. For me, I think that puts African nations in a position of weakness. If other African nations are still colonized and you try to nationalize, what will occur is you'll try to sell the output or the gross domestic product of your nation to the world market. When, you know, who are the buyers in the world market? You're either going to be selling to the Western nations, or going to sell to Russia, Japan, or China. And the Western nations often operate in a block, right? So that they can basically depress prices to a point that, you know, you're getting crumbs on the dollar for what you're producing. And the Chinese and the Russians know that the West isn't willing to really pay you, or even worse, sometimes when you nationalize, the West will put economic sanctions on you, like what they did in Zimbabwe. So you can't sell to the Western world. You're only left to sell to China or Russia. China and Russia knows that they're the only market for your product, so they're going to pay you pennies on the dollar, right? That isn't helpful in my opinion. The only way that becomes helpful is if other African nations, and I just, let me be clear here. I don't like the idea of these current African nations. I'm a Garveyite, and I'm of the mind that we actually need to create a nation or regional nations. But I don't, even if we create regional nations on the African continent, I don't think that they should be a composite of these neo-colonies that are holdovers from colonization, because these colonies only exist, and I keep saying this, and I want to stress it, they only exist to facilitate the colonization process. We need to do away with them. That's my perspective. I don't know if my brother and my sister agree with me, but that's where I stand on it. So yeah.
I actually agree with a lot of what you said. I think the problem with simply nationalizing the resources is that it puts you in a similar position. So now the government owns the resources. So the problem is, the exact problem that we have is that you have an outside country who wants to gain control of those resources. You're putting your trust on that government leader being of good character, and that government leader is not going to sell a part of the resources without you knowing, or give something away to a different outside country. So I think there's a lot of the same types of problems that exist with with neocolonialism as it exists today. I advocate communal control of resources, meaning that if you have, that's another discussion. How do you divide a community? How do you create a community? Is it like something that we do intentionally, or is it something that already exists from prior to colonialism? Like, are they the tribes that existed prior to colonialism coming here? That's a whole question that would have to be dealt with, at the proper time. But I believe that a community should control the resources. To me, the best example of something like this happening is a country like Barbuda. Barbuda, after the slave trade ended, interestingly enough, a lot of times whenever Africans were no longer enslaved, they automatically went back to communalism, collectivism, or what white people would call socialism. That's what they automatically reverted to. And that's interesting that whenever slavery was abolished, the Barbudans automatically went back to a collectivist system, to where they had a rule of law that no one who did not live in Barbuda could own land in Barbuda. And not only that, if you want to lease land in Barbuda, you have to get permission from the people. So the people actually have to vote. And I think that was a brilliant system, to where if, when we have these deals, these trade deals, that the people are voting on the deals, and not individuals who are high paid, but actual everyday citizens who live on the land that they're trying to ration away. So that's not state ownership. I think state ownership has its own problems that can come with it. As far as your second question, what about manufacturing the resources to a finished product and then selling to the world market? Absolutely. To me, whatever makes sense, whatever works for our people, whatever does not compromise us as a collective, I am completely, I'm not against it.
I think people should do what Patrice Lumumba tried to do, and you don't sell to no world market. I think if African people control their own raw resources in the African continent, then they say the West can't have any. Now, while I say that, I understand that means the CIA is going to be gunning for you, because the whole thing is that if you decide that African resources should only be for African people, then you know what? The West has built itself on the enslavement and colonization and imperialism of Africa. So the thing is, the whole project of modernity is at risk when African people decide for themselves to keep what's within their domain to themselves. And that I include that into the diaspora in many different aspects of what it is that we have to contribute to our markets. When we talk about hip hop, if we kept white people out of hip hop, then white people will be like, you know what, there is no hip hop. That's what they do. They attack us. If the people in Haiti decided, you know what, you don't get access to the aluminum here in our mountains, then you know what? They're going to terrorize Haitians. Now, that's been happening, by the way. But I'm just saying, like when African people decide, you know what, this is ours and we should have control over it, as Omowale said before, we should have control over who we allocate what to, then that's when the fundamental problem of white domination it has to reimpose itself. So white people have this entitlement, this antagonistic idea that they have the domain of everything that's in the world. And when African people own what they have, the first thing they say is, oh, you're tribalist. Oh, you're chaotic. Oh, you can't control it. Oh, it's only going to be black on black violence over there. Or, oh, it's savage. Black people can't run their own government. Then they have all these excuses for why they should come over there and reestablish democracy. You see what I mean? So yeah, like world market, no world market, no African market, only the black people.
All right, I have some counterpoints, but I'm not going to because we'll be here all night. So thank you everyone for watching. And we'll be back. Maybe we'll address this other question we have about religion and Pan-Africanism.
Oh, Christianity is capitalism. Socialism acts like Christianity.
And I'm a Christian, so we can have that debate next. Good night, everyone. Thanks for watching, and see you all another. Do any of you need to plug anything?
Yeah. So yeah, I now have my own YouTube channel. So definitely, I'll write something in the chat. Hit the little 3 buttons and make sure you go subscribe. I'm doing a segment called the Black Prophet Hour. It's pretty fun. We battle in ignorance and we are raising consciousness over there. So definitely check it out.
Nah, peace and love. Good night.
All right. Good night, everyone.